I'm going to show you how to send REST requests. Let's get started.
Hi everyone, I'm Watrous from VVork. If this is your first time here and you want to learn about automating, programming, and monitoring in VMware environments, you're in the right place. Start now by subscribing and click the bell so that you don't miss a thing.
This is part 3 in a 10-part video series in which we're exploring how to make REST API calls. In this video, I'm going to show you how to send REST requests. All right, let's take a look at another example REST API. This time, the REST API that we're going to be using is available at restapiexample.com. Now, when we go there, this is the main homepage, but what we actually want to work with is what they call the dummy REST API. So let's click there. And as you can see, it's taking us to dummy.restapiexample.com. And on this page, they have documentation about what we can do with this API. The basic idea behind this API is it simulates an employee database. So we're going to be able to get information about all the employees, get information about one employee, add an employee, delete an employee, update an employee. Again, the usual operations. To get started, again, we can take a look at the concise documentation here. It tells us that we have these different operations that do things like look up all of the employees. That's what the first one's going to do. The second one's going to look up a specific employee. We'll be able to create an employee, update an employee, delete an employee by following the information here on the screen. If you'd like to, you can hit pause and perhaps try implementing this first REST operation by yourself. So if you'd like to, hit pause. Otherwise, let's see how you can actually do this. So looking at the documentation here, it says that the route or the path to the operation that lets us look up all the employees, again, to look up all the employees, we're going to go to /employee. We're going to do a get, and if you look real closely in this documentation, the actual URL that we're going to use does not end in /employee, which is said over here, actually ends in /employees. So we're going to be really careful here to make certain that we interpret the documentation so that we use it correctly. So let's go ahead and go over to Postman. And in Postman, let's create a new collection. And we're going to call this collection restapiexample.com. And we're going to add our first request, which is going to be called get all employees.
You know, it's not just Brian that can do training. Check out the URL in the description below to find more training, even by me, Virtual Buddha.
As we saw in the documentation, the URL that we need to use is https://dummy.restapiexample.com/API/v4/employees. So this part here is the base API that we're going to use for all of the different operations that we are going to be invoking. So whether we want one employee or multiple employees, or we want to update them or delete them, every REST request that we make is going to begin with this base URL. All right, so we've got the base URL /employees. Why don't we go ahead and save our new REST request. And now that it's saved, let's send it. As you can see, we've gotten back a response. And before we look at the response body, we're going to check the status code. We got a 200, which means this body, this response body, contains data about the employees that we just requested. Now, as you can see here, we can see by looking in the pretty view here, we can see that there's an employee called Tiger Nixon. There's an employee called Garrett Winters. In fact, there are a bunch of different employees. If you wanted to, you could use the pretty view or the raw view or any of these views here to actually see what's going on with this data. But as I've mentioned before, it might be useful sometimes to take this data into Notepad++ and use that plugin I introduced you to a few moments ago. So let's take this data and go to Notepad++. In Notepad++, I'm going to type Control-N to open up a new tab. I'm going to type Control-V to paste in the text from the response body. And as you can see, by default, Notepad++ isn't doing much in the way of formatting this. This is just the format that we got from the pretty view. But we don't have color coding and we don't have the expand collapse buttons, at least not yet. What we're going to do so that we can see that stuff is go to Plugins. Then we're going to go to JSON Tools, and we're going to do that pretty print that we saw before. All right, so now we can see the data. It's color-coded, and it has these handy-dandy plus-minus buttons that we can use to expand or collapse the data. Speaking of which, at the high level, this JSON-formatted response body gives us the status of the request. So in addition to the 200 status code that we saw, this API happens to be returning status information in the response body additionally. It's also returning a message, so it says successful, all the records have been fetched. And then in this data section, this is actually an array of all of our different employees. Now, this response body is a bit more complex than what we've seen before. So let me show you, as the response bodies, as this JSON gets more and more complex, let me show you some tricks that I use to help myself understand what's in this JSON. So I like to start off by going to View and collapsing everything by choosing Full to All. And as you can see, right now we can just see the very beginning of our JSON. It begins with that open curly brace. But if we expand one level by clicking on the plus symbol, we can see, as I just described a few moments ago, the three topmost pieces of information. Now we talked about status, we talked about message. Let's explore data. If we expand data, as we can see from this square bracket and the accompanying closing square bracket, data is an array. In this case here, it's actually an array of our 24 different employees. So if we go to line number 4 and expand this array entry, we can see that it's holding an object that's describing our employee called Tiger Nixon. It tells us what his age is, tells us what his salary is, tells us, well, looks like he doesn't have a profile image, but he does have an ID. Again, that's an ID that we'll use to uniquely identify him. If we want to, we can open up or expand the next section and see, here's Garrett Winters, and so forth. So by collapsing everything and then expanding little pieces at a time, I can work on the left side of the screen here in Notepad++ to understand what's going on in this JSON. But I also like to use again, what's it called? It's called JSON Tools. I like to use the JSON Tools tree view, which we see over here, because it too helps me to understand what's going on. So at the top level, in our JSON code here, we've got an object. So open curly brace, close curly brace is an object. If we expand, just like we saw over on the left side, we see here in the tree viewer the three topmost pieces of information in this JSON formatted response body. And if we click the plus symbol here for data, we can see the 24 different objects for our 24 different employees. Again, if we go into index 0, we can see Tiger Nixon. If we go into index 1, we can see Garrett Winters. And as we do so, you're presumably noticing that it's automatically highlighting the code over here on the left so that you can find that particular piece of data. Now, as we do this here, there are going to be times when, rather than hunting around and expanding and collapsing, there are going to be times you're going to want to use search patterns to find what you're looking for. For example, let's suppose we want to look just at this user called Sonia Frost. Well, to look at Sonia Frost, we are going to write an expression up top here. So @data would return the entire data array. So if I do a submit query, I get back the entire array without the message and status. So over here on the right, where we're doing the actual filtering, I only see data. Now if I say something such as square bracket 9, close square bracket, and then do a query, you'll notice that now we're only looking at one employee, that Sonia Frost that we just saw a moment ago. And if we keep using this technique, we can go further and further into the JSON. For example, maybe I just want to know what Sonia's salary is. So if I modify my search pattern and submit a query, now I'm getting just that one piece of information. Now this is not a course in Notepad++, but I simply wanted to give you a few little tricks that you could use using Notepad++ to help you understand the response bodies that we're going to be getting back from lots of REST requests that we're going to be making. All right, so that's easy enough. Let's go back to Postman, and as you can see, we have a new request, but we saw in the documentation that there's a bunch of other requests that we could submit. So let's go back to the documentation. So back in our web browser, we can see that there's another request that we can make, an operation that looks up a specific employee. Now, I didn't do this before, but you may have noticed that over here on the right, we have this details link for each of these to let us know more about how to use each of these different operations. For example, for the first operation where we're looking up all the employees, if we click details, it tells us here, all right, here's the route to the operation, you need to do a get, and here's what you can expect the results to look like. Again, for each of the different operations, the details page will let you know what the response body is likely to look like, and for certain operations, it will also tell you what your request body needs to look like. All right, so let's go back to the second operation. It's going to allow us to look up a single employee. And the way that we're going to do that is with the right URL, and that URL is going to end with this placeholder thing. So open curly brace, ID, close curly brace is going to allow us to specify the ID of the employee that we want to look up. All right, so we know the basic format here. Let's go on over to Postman. We're going to take our existing request, we're going to duplicate it, and we're going to edit our new duplicated copy. It's not going to be a copy, so we're going to change the name here. It's not going to look up all the employees. It's going to look up one employee. So we've changed the name, and in doing so, it has automatically saved the name change. Now, as you just saw in the documentation, if you want to look up a single employee, it's not going to end in /employees. It's going to end in /employee/ and then we need to specify which employee we want to look up. Why don't we see what happens when we look up ID number 9. Now in this specific example, I am hard coding ID 9. Later on in this video series, I'm going to show you how to use variables to make this much more flexible. But for right now, we're just going to hard code 9. So let's save our new request, and then we will send our request. We get back a response. First thing we check is the status code. We got a 200, that's good. And as you can see here, we are looking at a particular employee. In this specific case, though, it didn't turn out to be Sonia. Instead, it's Colleen. Remember, when we were looking at the JSON body that we received when we looked up all the employees, we found that if we looked at data index 9, here, let me do a search, in the tree viewer, that actually found Sonia Frost. So we have some sort of one-off issue going on here. Let's go back and look at all of the data. And if we go look at ID number 9, so where's this Colleen person that we just saw? Okay, so again, we have a one off by one issue. This API just happens to work the way it does. When you specify that ID through your URL, just be aware that you're going to have to adjust to get the numbering right. So the ID in the URL is apparently going to not be 9 because this array is indexed from 0. So if we want this particular Sonia, we're going to have to say 10. Again, that's just a quirk of the way this particular API works, but we can fix that easy enough. Again, we're working with different REST APIs. You may have to figure out little issues like that, but that's a pretty simple little change. Let's save our request, send our request again, check the status code, and this time indeed we see the employee record for Sonia Frost. So now we can look up all the employees, or we can look up one employee. While you weren't looking, I ran our new REST request several times in quick succession. And as you can see from this response, I got back a status code of 429. Not the 200 we were hoping for, but 429. That means if we go look at the response body, this is not going to contain information about employees. Furthermore, if we go in raw, this is not information about employees. Looking at those first two views, we may not immediately see what's going on, but if you look at the preview, we see a web page defined by HTML code being displayed here. Now you may have noticed that in the pretty page, this is an HTML doc. The raw page is showing us the same thing, but isn't it nice and easy to see what's going on here looking into the preview page? So again, there's another example using the preview page. But let's actually, if you want to, hit pause and look through this HTML code, but you won't find the answer to why we're getting this status code of 429. If you go online and look up the meaning of the status code 429, you'll discover that this REST server, like other REST servers, at times will implement traffic throttling in order to avoid being overwhelmed by too many requests by too many users. This particular REST server has a specific amount of time that it wants me to wait before I submit another request. Whether that's a request using this REST request or this REST request, I can't just keep submitting requests one after the other. I have to wait a certain amount of time. So how do I find out how much time that is? Well, perhaps we could go look at the REST documentation and find the answer there. I actually found it a different place. Whenever I get a non-200 status code, I'm quite likely going to see diagnostic information here in the response body, although in this case we don't. Or the other place I go looking for diagnostic information at times is the headers. Now, these are not request headers, but rather the response headers from the REST server. If we look at the request headers, in this particular case, you can see that it has set a header called retry after, and the value is 59. What that header and the 429 status code is telling us is that we are being rate limited. We can't just keep submitting this REST request, but if we'll wait 59 seconds in between each request, then we will be able to submit this request again. Now, I'm certain I've been talking for at least 59 seconds. So why don't we go back to our same request that just failed. And once again, I'm going to click send. And you'll notice that this time I get back a 200. And the body indeed contains information about an employee. And I did not get a 429. Again, I waited long enough. As you continue working with the REST API example.com API, just be aware that you will at times get a 429 status code. That doesn't mean that there's a problem with your request. It just means you need to wait roughly a minute before you can submit that request again. All right, so there we have it. What else can we learn? Well, we can learn to do lots of other things by, once again, checking the documentation. So it says here, another operation that we can perform will allow us to create a new employee. Now, this new request is going to be a little bit different. All the requests that we've been doing so far are doing GET requests. GET requests allow us to look up information about an object that, or a resource that the server already is storing. It's a resource that already exists. The post method is used when we want to tell the server to create a new resource, such as a new employee. So we can see here what the format of the URL is going to be. So we'll say post and then a URL that looks like this. But there's another thing about when you do a post or a put that you need to know about. So let's set up the basics, and then we're going to focus on what is it that's different that you have to do when doing a post. So I'm going to copy our URL. I'm going to remember I need to do a post. We'll go back to Postman, and here in Postman, we can copy either these duplicate either these existing requests, and we're going to this time say that we want to, let me edit that, we want to change the name to create one employee. And this time it's not going to be a get, it's going to be a post. So we change this to post, and the URL, according to our documentation, needs to look like this. And conceptually, we're done. Conceptually, we could hit save, then we could hit send, and it would create a new account. But notice, I didn't say anything about the new employee that we're trying to create. All I said was I want to create an employee. I didn't say what the employee's name is, I didn't say what their age is, didn't say what their salary is, didn't give any of that information. So we need to do a bit more for this to work. But let me show you first what happens if we send this request without properly setting it up. If we send the request, you'll notice that we get back a status code of 200, which seems to indicate that everything's okay. And it actually says that we added a record, but again, we did not specify any of the details about this user. So who knows what the username is, or what the employee name is. We don't know what the employee's salary or age is. This particular REST server seems to be perfectly okay with that. I don't think it makes sense to create a new employee record with none of that information, but apparently there's no error checking in this example API to catch that. So yes, you are going to get a 200 if you do this wrong. Yes, it's going to tell you it successfully added the new employee, but it's not a very interesting new entry. So let's go finish setting up this request correctly. What we need to do is to set up the request body. Now, we've been looking at the response body, but what we need to do now is to set up the request body. Now, the request body allows us to pass in different types of data. Right now, we're passing in no data at all. What we want to do is to start passing in some data, and we're going to do that by passing in some raw data in JSON format. And in theory here, all we need to do is to pass in a JSON object, so open curly brace, close curly brace, and pass in the employee name. Well, to get the JSON syntax correct, you need to double quote this. So maybe we pass in employee name. I'm just guessing here. Surely there's got to be a better way of finding this. And we'd pass in the value. But again, I don't want to guess here. I want to know for certain what the actual information is that I need to specify here. So I'm going to go check our REST API documentation. Again, going back to our browser and going to our API documentation, let's go click on details and see what details tells us. So the details page tells us what the response body is going to look like. That's what we see over here. But we need to pass in some data through the request body. This is the format of the data. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to go back to Postman. And this was the right idea, but apparently it's not called employee name. Rather, it's just name. Now, if we want to, we can make this pretty. So let's put some new lines here. And while we're at it, why don't we add some new lines here? So now our JSON formatted request body looks good. It would have worked equally well just having it as a single string, but we need to pass in data, and this is how we pass it in. Now, one of the things you might notice here is when we use this REST API, we are not going to specify the ID. The documentation did not explicitly say that, but we do not pass in the ID. That's going to be an ID that the REST server itself is going to set up. So all we need to do is pass in the name, the salary, and the age. So let's save first. Then let's send this request. And again, we got back a 200, but notice this time we're actually getting back more interesting response here. So it just created a new employee record for an employee called Test. I'll tell you that. Let's do this again. Let's put me in there. So I'm Brian Watrous. My salary is massive, and I'm not going to tell you how old I am. We'll just put in a placeholder there. So again, let's send, and you can see that, we got one of those 429s. Hit pause to think about why you got that 429. In order to save us a little time here, I'll cut out this part of the video. All right, presumably you remember what 429 is about. I got the 429 status code simply because I submitted this request too soon after the previous request. But I've waited a bit of time. I'm yakking to chew up some more time. Plus, I cut out some time in the video. So surely by now, the rate limiting time has elapsed. I should be able to send. And sure enough, I got back a 200. And you can see that it's added an employee record for Brian Watrous. His salary is massive, and he apparently doesn't want you to know what his age is. Now, notice there's an additional piece of information that's been added to this employee record. This is the ID that the REST server generated. I did not pass in the ID. I just passed in the name of the employee, the salary, and the age. That information got plugged into the employee record, plus a presumably unique ID was generated by the REST server itself. So as you can see, creating employees is relatively straightforward. We just need to do a post request. But what else can we do? According to our API documentation, let me go back a page here. According to our REST API documentation, we can do a put to update information about the user. So we can update information about a particular user by saying /update followed by their unique ID. We might need to, first of all, look up all the employees to find that ID, but assuming we know that employee's ID, we can modify information about that user by doing a put followed by this URL. Now, as you know, get is used to get information about a resource that already exists in the server. Post is used for creating a new resource in the server. Put is used to modify a resource in the REST server. So we're going to do this, but once again, we're going to go to the details page because we need to know, once again, what the body, specifically the request body, needs to look like. So here's the general format of the request body. And what we're going to do is go back to Postman. We're going to duplicate one of these requests. We're going to edit that request, give it a more useful name. So we're going to say update one employee. And if I recall correctly, the URL is supposed to be update followed by that employee's ID. So what was the ID for that Brian Watrous guy? His ID was apparently 9159. So let's go to our new REST request and we'll hard code that specific ID. Again, later on in the video series, I'll show you how to use variables instead to make this more flexible. But for right now, we're going to use that ID. Now, just like when we created a new employee object, now that we're modifying the employee object, we're going to need to set up the request body. By default, the request body looks just like we saw for the post REST request that we just did. If we wanted to double check that, again, we could go check our documentation to see exactly what the format is of the request body. In this particular case, it just happens to be the case that the body looks the same whether you do a post or a, hey, wait a second, what have I forgotten to do here? If you want to update an employee, it's not going to be a post, it's going to be a put. There we go. So again, for this put operation, let me save that so it'll update over here on the left. This put operation's request body looks exactly the same. And notice once again, according to the documentation, we are not supposed to specify the ID. So I'm going to get rid of this new line that I added here because that's not the way this REST server API works. Other REST servers might want you to specify the ID or a key or something like that in the request body, but not this REST server. This REST server does not want the ID in the request body. It wants the request ID in the path of the URL. By the way, this is a path string. We'll be talking more about those later on as we go through these videos. All right, so I've saved my new request. Let's send it. And as you can see, this time we've gotten back a 200 code. We have successfully updated that particular user. But what you might be noticing here, if you're watching real closely, so whereas before this user with ID 9159 used to be called Brian Watrous, now the name in that employee record is Test. And now the salary is $123 a year and the age is 23. Again, that used to be Brian Watrous, a gazillion dollars, and a mysterious age, but we have managed to successfully update that employee record. Now I'm going to tell you a little secret here about this thing called REST API example.com. That API allows us to do things like look up employee records. It allows us to create new employee records. It allows you to modify employee records. But in reality, the REST server is not actually changing the data in the server. So when we did the post operation, it appeared to create a new employee record, but it didn't. If you create a new employee record and then do a get all employees, you won't see that new record. Because even though the post operation here looks like a new employee record has been created, the full functionality of the REST server isn't there. Again, that's fine for our purposes here. I'm not worried whether or not we're actually storing data in their employee database. I just want to use this API to show you the mechanics of looking in the API documentation, creating requests, checking the response, and see how things work. We'll look later on in this video at ways we can actually successfully create new resources and update resources in an actual REST server. But for right now, we'll use this REST API example.com API with that limitation. All right, going back to our documentation, and if we go back a page, you can see there's also a delete operation. Again, this is going to look like it's doing a delete, but in reality, the data doesn't get deleted. But we're going to pretend it does. So let's go back to Postman, and we're going to duplicate our previous request. We're going to change this one to a delete, and let me check the documentation again. So it's /delete. So we need to change the word update here to delete. And while we're at it, why don't we update the name of this request? We're going to call this request delete one employee. If you look at the REST API documentation, it's going to tell you that you need to leave the body blank. As a general pattern, when you do a get method or a delete method, in general, for get and delete, you will use a blank request body. On the other hand, post method requests and put methods requests in general need you to fill out the request body. All right, so let's save our new request. We'll send it. Looking at the status code, it looks like it all worked. And looking here, it looks like it successfully deleted that user. But again, the server is not actually changing any of the data that it's storing. So feel free to continue exploring with this REST API example.com. It provides a good platform to learn and understand how this is all working. But as I've pointed out, it's not actually making any changes to the data stored in the REST server. But we learned a lot of new things that we can do. So you learned how to look up all the employees, learned how to look up one employee. You learned how to create an employee. It didn't really create an employee, but it sure looked like it did. We learned to update an employee and delete an employee. Again, these last three didn't actually do anything on the REST server, but if we just ignore that, we were able to use this API to do some interesting things. But there's lots more that we can do with REST APIs.
Join me in the next video for more example APIs.